Picture our world as it was 70 millennia ago. It was not the bustling, clamorous, globally linked sphere we inhabit now. Instead, it was a different realm, a peaceful expanse. Disturbingly still, dawn breaks across the African plains, yet an unsettling feeling lingers. The heavens appear in an odd hue, a reddish gray, laden with dust that makes each breath laborious. The air has chilled. Not a normal winter's cold, but a peculiar chill, as though the earth itself had fallen ill. Throughout the vast continent, indeed across the whole globe, the number of living humans barely exceeds 10,000. Not millions, nor even 100,000, merely 10,000 souls, perhaps even fewer. Certain calculations place the count at a mere 3,000 reproductive pairs. That was all. The sum total of humanity could have been contained within a modest college football arena. Every future being, every soul yet to be born, every society that would later flourish, all dangled by the slimmest margin conceivable. Should you be listening to drift off? That is precisely my purpose in creating these narratives. Consider subscribing, and please share your location and the current hour. I read the comments, and the variety is astonishing. Listeners in Tokyo at dawn, London during midday, Los Angeles in the dead of night, all engaged with the same tale of how we nearly never existed to witness anything. Nowadays, more than 8 billion humans inhabit the Earth. We are ubiquitous, seemingly invincible, erecting skyscrapers that graze the heavens, dispatching mechanical explorers to Mars, linking every remote area with intangible webs of data. Our behavior suggests we possess the planet, as though we have always resided here and shall remain forever. We teetered on the brink of annihilation, not a slow dwindling, not a gentle fade. We peered into the void, and the void returned our gaze. This narrative recounts that moment when humankind nearly disappeared. Chances are you have never encountered it, for it occurred in such distant antiquity that it strains the imagination, yet it truly occurred. Proof resides within your very genetic code, etched in volcanic debris strewn over landmasses, manifest in hereditary markers that researchers can follow as one would fingerprints. It's akin to evidence from an attack where the nearly lifeless victim just managed to endure. The instigator was an Indonesian peak that erupted with the might of several million nuclear warheads, Mount Toba. That name ought to be as well known as the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, yet the majority have never learned of it. Nevertheless, what transpired there 74 millennia ago ranks among the most devastating occurrences in humanity's existence, not merely in recorded times, but in our entire story. This is what we understand. Toba was far more than a typical volcano. It belonged to the category of supervolcanoes, an entity so colossal that its eruption did not merely impact the surrounding region. Its consequences spread across the whole globe. We are discussing a volcanic blast 5,000 times mightier than the Mount St. Helens explosion. The blast was so forceful that it hurled 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the air. That volume of material would suffice to cover the entirety of Texas beneath 15 feet of rubble. The eruption plume climbed 50 miles into the sky. Yes, 50 miles. That altitude is double the height at which most weather phenomena take place. It burst through the stratosphere and continued upward, releasing sulfur dioxide and ash into the highest atmospheric layers. These materials lingered for years, traversing the planet, obscuring the sunlight. In a matter of weeks, the cloud of ash had encircled the whole world. The temperature plummeted by 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Certain areas experienced even greater declines. The Earth descended into a period often referred to by scientists as a volcanic winter. For 6 years, there was near constant darkness, vegetation withering away, creatures perishing from hunger, entire ecological systems falling one after another, like a line of dominoes. And in some corner of Africa, small groups of our earliest forebears, your ancestors and mine, gazed upward at the gloomy heavens and confronted a straightforward decision: to change or to perish. The majority made the wrong selection. More accurately, most never had any real choice. They perished either swiftly or gradually due to hunger, freezing temperatures, and the total disintegration of all that had sustained them. Yet a handful, a very small number, managed to endure against all odds, and the proof of their endurance, their frantic battle through the most severe climatic disaster ever encountered by humanity. That story is inscribed in every cell of your being at this very moment. You see, when populations decline so drastically, they imprint genetic markers. Consider it in this way. Picture a library containing 100,000 distinct volumes. Now, suppose a fire consumes 99% of those books. Only 1,000 remain. Even if you subsequently reproduce those 1,000 volumes until you once more have 100,000, every single one is a duplicate of the original 1,000. The variety is lost permanently. This is precisely what occurred with human genetics. Researchers can examine our DNA in the present day, all 8 billion of us, and observe that we are astonishingly alike, more so than would be expected, and more so than other creatures with far smaller numbers. Chimpanzees, with an estimated 300,000 individuals in the wild, possess significantly greater genetic variation than every human put together. That is not typical. It is the mark of a bottleneck, an extremely tight one. For many decades, geneticists believed that some occurrence in our history had shrunk human numbers to perilously small levels. However, they were uncertain of the cause, the timing, and just how near we had been to total annihilation. Then came the discovery of Toba more precisely. They uncovered strata of volcanic ash concealed within old Earth throughout Africa, across Asia, and throughout the Middle East. This ash was precisely as old as the period of the genetic bottleneck. The clues began aligning. Do you know that sensation when you understand just how narrowly you escaped calamity? Similar to when you avoid a collision by mere inches, your heart racing, and you think, that could have been the end? That is exactly what our whole species experienced. But it was not a fleeting moment. It stretched into years, decades, perhaps centuries of clinging to existence, while the Earth itself appeared resolute in its effort to destroy us. And this is the thought that prevents me from sleeping. The puzzle that researchers continue to investigate. How did we manage to survive? What did that small group of several thousand individuals possess that the rest lacked? Was it sheer fortune? Was it their location? Or was it something related to their mindset, their manner of working together? Consider how they persisted, never surrendering, even though yielding might have seemed far simpler. The clues lie beneath volcanic deposits, encoded in our DNA, concealed within ancient ruins that modern science is just beginning to decipher. Yet, our discoveries reveal far more than a mere survival tale. They tell us something profound about the essence of humanity. This narrative speaks of resilience, adaptation, and an innate deep-seated refusal to vanish, apparently woven into our very core. For we did more than merely endure Toba. We rose to become the most triumphant large mammal on Earth. We grew from a scant 10,000 souls, dispersed throughout Africa, into 8 billion inhabitants spanning all continents. We journeyed from the brink of annihilation to rulers of the globe. How, then, did we accomplish this? Let us journey to the very start, before the heavens grew dim, when our forebears remained unaware that their world was on the verge of permanent transformation. Cast your mind back, far back, 74,000 years into the past. This was an era before any civilization, before farming, before written records, when humankind had no notion that it would soon confront its greatest challenge. The Earth appeared vastly different in those days. Yet in numerous respects, it was oddly recognizable. Africa, the cradle of our species, presented a breathtaking patchwork of landscapes. The savannas rolled out without end, golden plains speckled with acacia trees whose flat crowns were etched against vivid blue skies. In the rainy season, those plains would burst into an exuberance of wildlife, with wildebeest migrations so vast that even the Serengeti might appear empty by comparison. Thousands upon thousands of elephants roamed alongside lions, leopards, hyenas, and wild dogs, all pursuing the plentiful game that human hunters also relied upon. The woodlands were distinct, yet equally bountiful. Expansive tropical rainforests blanketed much of Central Africa, their canopies so dense that they cast a perpetual twilight upon the forest floor. Rivers wound through these verdant temples, their shores bustling with hippopotamuses, crocodiles, and innumerable fish. To those who understood the forest's language, it served as both a pharmacy and a market. Berries, nuts, tubers, healing herbs all ready to gather if you possess the wisdom. The shorelines provided their own riches. Shellfish banks extending for miles, rock pools holding fish that had been stranded, and seabird nesting grounds where you could collect eggs by the thousand during nesting time. Certain human communities had already realized that the coastline was among the planet's most dependable food supplies. On the savanna, days could pass without a successful hunt, but the ocean tide surged in twice each day, unfailingly delivering sustenance. Such was the world that nurtured early Homo sapiens. Not quite Eden, yet nearly so. Yet what renders this era truly captivating is that humans did not dwell alone far from it. 74 millennia ago, Earth was home to no fewer than 4 distinct human species, perhaps even more. Ponder that. Various types of humans, all coexisting on one world, all vying for identical resources, each striving to endure in a world indifferent to which among them would succeed. Within Africa, Homo sapiens were still fairly recent arrivals. Early modern humans had appeared sometime in the range of 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, depending on one's definition of modernity. By 74,000 years in the past, we had existed long enough to have dispersed across nearly all of Africa. Yet we were still in the process of evolving, still acquiring the characteristics that would later secure our dominance, and we were not even the most numerous human population in that era. Across Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals were flourishing marvelously. They had existed for a minimum of 400,000 years, conceivably even more. They were exquisitely suited to the Ice Age climate, commanding their surroundings in a manner that would surely impress any contemporary hunter. Neanderthal groups were strong, their lands securely claimed, and their methods of survival honed over countless millennia. Imagine placing a wager 74 millennia in the past. You would likely have backed Neanderthals as the human lineage destined for enduring success. Neanderthals surpassed Homo sapiens in strength, were superbly suited to frigid environments, and boasted a reliable history of enduring numerous glacial periods. They were far from a crude forerunner of modern humanity. These were refined, clever, culturally elaborate top predators. To the east, spanning Asia and reaching the Pacific, the Denisovans were pursuing their own path. Our knowledge of Denisovans is limited due to sparse fossil remains, yet genetic clues reveal they thrived, adjusted readily, and occupied vast territories. They successfully settled environments stretching from Siberia's frozen plains to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. Such accomplishments demand profound survival abilities. Then we encounter Homo erectus, the elder statesman of our human lineage. Homo erectus had persisted for close to 2 million years. They were the initial human species to venture from Africa, the first to control fire, and the first to craft advanced hunting methods. By 74,000 years ago, they had largely vanished from the continents, outrivaled by newer, more flexible species. However, secluded groups lingered on Indonesian islands, among them the population that later gave rise to the renowned hobbits of Flores. 4 distinct human species, 4 unique evolutionary trajectories, 4 separate approaches to survival, all coexisting on a single world. From time to time, some of these species did cross paths. As Homo sapiens started to leave Africa, likely in modest scouting parties assessing migration possibilities, they would have encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East. Genetic proof confirms occasional interbreeding occurred, yet generally, these species inhabited distinct ecological roles, separate territories, indeed, different realms. Returning to Africa, where most Homo sapiens dwelled. Dwelling there, existence was at once simpler and more intricate than one might picture. So let us begin with figures. What was the human count? And here the tale grows fascinating and slightly alarming. Finest approximations indicate that 74,000 years in the past, the combined human population of all species ranged perhaps from 1 to 10 million souls, perhaps even fewer, and that is quite modest. Today's New York City holds more inhabitants than the whole world did at that time. For Homo sapiens alone, we are likely discussing at most a few 100,000 individuals, and they were not gathered in towns or sizable communities. They were dispersed throughout Africa in tiny, secluded bands, divided by enormous expanses of unforgiving landscape. A customary human group of that era consisted of perhaps 20 to 50 people. Essentially, extended family clusters, grandparents, mothers and fathers, offspring, aunts, uncles, cousins. Every person you recognized, every soul you were likely to meet in your whole existence, dwelling and journeying together. Several bands could occupy a broader region, which anthropologists term a tribe. Perhaps 500 individuals in total, scattered over a territory comparable to a small nation. One would meet neighboring bands from time to time at seasonal meeting sites, water holes in the dry period, spots where particular fruits matured, zones where wildlife gathered naturally. These encounters held great importance. They were not merely social occasions, they were the means to discover spouses beyond one's own. Your immediate kin, how you exchanged good stone for implements from one area, ochre for bodily adornment from another, news on the movement of herds, and how you sustained bonds that could tip the balance between enduring and perishing during harsh periods. Yet for the majority of time, most bands operated independently, tiny clusters of humans traversing terrains that could engulf them entirely. Each day was absorbed in the unending quest for sustenance. Set aside all notions you hold regarding the ease of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. That portrayal is largely fanciful fiction, certainly for this era. Existence demanded great effort. The men usually served as hunters, though not on a daily basis, nor with consistent success. The pursuit of large animals was perilous and draining labor. One could pursue an antelope for many hours under the blazing savanna sun, only to have it escape. Even more concerning, that chase might draw the notice of lions who deemed you a simpler target. A triumph, like bringing down a sizable creature, such as a zebra or buffalo, was a major event worthy of celebration. Such meat would nourish the entire group for several days, yet reliance on large animals was never guaranteed. Therefore, hunters also went after smaller game: rabbits, birds, lizards, anything they could capture using throwing sticks, basic spears, or progressively more refined snares. Each calorie was precious. Gathering was the primary task for women, children, and the elderly. In truth, this activity provided the bulk of the group's calories for much of the time. Their knowledge was vast. They recognized hundreds of plants which were safe to eat, which had healing properties, and which could be lethal if consumed improperly. They understood precisely where to unearth tubers and roots, and how to treat poisonous nuts to render them edible. They knew the ripening seasons of various fruits and how to follow bees back to their nests for honey. That wisdom was invaluable, gathered across centuries and transmitted through tales, practical instruction, and gritty experience. Should that knowledge be lost, should a person who knew safe mushrooms perish, lives would be lost. Everyone contributed their labor. Youngsters, as young as 5 or 6, aided by gathering berries, catching insects, and assisting with food preparation. By the time they reached adolescence, they were anticipated to have mastered the survival abilities required in adulthood. No structured classrooms existed. Instead, learning came from relentless observation and hands-on practice. Your instruction consisted of observing your mother as she recognized healing herbs, and your father as he showed you how to interpret animal footprints in the earth. The implements of the time were uncomplicated yet functional. Stone tools prevailed: hand axes crafted from flint or obsidian. Tools included scrapers for treating animal skins and sharp blades for slicing meat. Fashioning such instruments was a craft requiring many years to perfect. One needed to grasp how various types of stone break, how to direct blows to achieve the desired form, and how to care for tools to maintain their sharpness and usefulness. Among all innovations, fire may well have been the most significant. Humanity had likely attained mastery of fire about 400,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier. By 74,000 years ago, every human group knew how to ignite and sustain it. Fire brought warmth on cold nights and provided protection from predators. Neither lion nor leopard would voluntarily come near a fire. It also enabled cooking, which made food safer while increasing its calorie and nutrient content compared to raw fare. The human body could derive more energy from cooked meat and roots than from raw ones. In essence, Fire expanded the available food supply without necessitating extra hunting or foraging. Fire also fostered togetherness. People assembled in the evenings around the blaze, exchanging tales, sharing wisdom, reviewing the day's happenings, and making arrangements for the following day. It was there that children absorbed their people's spoken histories, and where elders conveyed the survival knowledge that sustained the entire group. But let us not idealize it excessively. Average lifespan was harsh, and the majority of children did not reach adulthood. Infant death rates likely hovered between 40 and 50%, and the combined effects of illness, mishaps, predatory animals, and inadequate nutrition claimed many lives. Surviving to the age of 15 gave you a fair likelihood of living to 40 or perhaps 50. However, reaching what we now think of as old age was rare, and childbirth posed especially significant dangers for women. In the absence of modern medical care, problems we would consider easily manageable today were often fatal. Still, the human species continued onward, for women continued to bear children, accepting those perils, and repeatedly wagering on what was yet to come. Accidents and wounds happened frequently and were frequently deadly. If you fractured a leg out on the savannah, you could no longer stay with your group, nor engage in hunting, nor gather, nor make any contribution. During the most difficult seasons, you could be abandoned. This was not due to malice, but because the continued existence of the community had to come before that of any single person. That was the harsh arithmetic. Harsh, ruthless, and required. Yet, there are also signs of kindness. Fossil remains of Neanderthals reveal people who lived for many years after enduring terrible wounds, indicating that their groups looked after them, provided them with food, and safeguarded them even when they were unable to help. Our own species likely acted in the same way. Human beings are social creatures. We care for our own whenever possible. The danger from predators was ever present. This is something difficult for people today to truly understand. When was the last occasion you felt concern about becoming someone else's meal? Yet 74,000 years in the past, humans were still deeply embedded in the food web. We had not yet reached the apex. Lions, leopards, hyenas, all these predators saw humans as possible victims, particularly the young or those found separated from their group. In certain areas, cave bears and crocodiles near rivers, and even sizable birds of prey, could snatch away little ones. You would not stray away on your own. You never journeyed after dark. You were perpetually aware of the closest tree or refuge. This constant peril molded human conduct at a deep level. We grew extremely communal because being alone spelled doom. We grew wary, distrustful of strange noises or motions. We evolved intricate means of exchanging information, for alerting one's community to peril was truly a question of survival. These were not mere aspects of character. They were survival tools, and there was also rivalry with other groups of people. Not different kinds of creatures, but other bands of our own species, conflicts over land for precious supplies, watering holes in arid areas, productive hunting areas, and places for refuge. At times, these disagreements were settled without violence, through discussion or joining of families, but at other times, they were not. Bones from that era reveal marks of conflict between persons, healed break patterns that match blows from weapons, and remains of people who perished from severe wounds. Our species could work together harmoniously inside our communities, yet we also had the capacity for aggression toward strangers. This is the core contradiction of human nature, and it was already completely established 74 millennia ago. Yet in spite of all these obstacles, the difficulty and peril and endless effort, humankind was actually managing fairly well. Not wonderfully, but adequately. The number of people was likely increasing gradually with each generation. Communities were expanding into fresh regions, exploring novel surroundings, and crafting innovative methods for living. Certain groups had started traveling beyond Africa, tracking herds of animals or resources along the coastline into the Sinai and further. These were the first steps of the enormous movement that would one day fill every continent. Technological progress was gradual, yet consistent. The shapes and plans of implements grew more refined. People were inventing fresh methods for hunting, for preparing meals, and for constructing dwellings. A few communities had started to produce art, etching linear designs upon stones or molding earth into small statues. The intellectual transformation that would ultimately bring about symbolic thought and intricate speech was already in full swing. Existence was difficult, yet it was steady, and humankind had discovered its own place. In our modest way, we were not just surviving but flourishing until the mountain erupted. Yet what lends this tale its sorrowful beauty is this: our forebears could not foresee what approached, had no understanding that their entire world might transform so utterly, so disastrously, and so swiftly. One evening, they drifted off in a world that still held logic, a place where staying alive was challenging, yet achievable. A realm where tomorrow seemed much like yesterday, and if you mastered the lessons passed down from your elders, if you labored diligently and enjoyed a dash of fortune, you could nurture your own offspring and hand those teachings to the children after them. Little did they suspect that nature was poised to sweep the board clean, that in a matter of weeks, the majority would perish, that their kind would dwindle to merely a few thousand souls, hanging on to existence in the final livable pockets of an ice-bound world. They were utterly unaware that they inhabited the closing hours of the world they recognized. In Sumatra, 3,000 miles from the closest human communities in Africa, molten rock had been accumulating under a mountain for millennia. Pressure grew steadily. The planet's outer shell swelled omens that none were prepared to interpret or comprehend. The people of 74,000 years ago were skilled in their crafts. They could decipher the skies, anticipate the movements of beasts, and locate moisture in the most parched terrains. As a species, they had gathered 200,000 years of wisdom for staying alive. Yet, they possessed no context for the impending event. No prior encounter, no recollection in all of human history had readied them for a supervolcano. And that renders what followed all the more astonishing. For when their world collapsed, when all they understood was annihilated, and 99% of their kind perished in the subsequent volcanic winter, those who remained refused to surrender. They endured. They transformed. They would not allow the human race to vanish into oblivion. However, we are leaping ahead in the story. Before that, we must grasp precisely what occurred when Toba stirred, and why it came so close to annihilating our entire lineage. For countless centuries it had lain in wait, concealed beneath a tropical haven, slumbering beneath thick layers of rainforest and volcanic earth so rich that vegetation burst forth with ferocious vitality. The people dwelling close by had not the faintest notion of what rested under their souls. They could not imagine that they were constructing their existence atop the planet's most hazardous geological formation. This was Toba, a supervolcano situated in the region we now name Sumatra, Indonesia. And 74,000 years ago, it roused itself. At this point, we should pause and clarify what we truly signify by the term supervolcano. The expression is bandied about frequently, yet few individuals genuinely comprehend the magnitude of what we refer to. It is already deeply unsettling. Mount Vesuvius entombed Pompeii beneath ash. The blast of Krakatoa in 1883 was audible from 3,000 miles away. Mount St. Helens sheared the summit from a peak and draped North America in darkened heavens. Each of these was a major eruption catastrophe, claiming thousands of lives, altering atmospheric conditions, and capturing global attention. Yet when measured against a supervolcano, these events amount to scarcely a murmur like firecrackers beside a nuclear weapon. A supervolcano does not merely erupt or simply explode. It detonates with such power that it can reshape the Earth's climate for years, perhaps for decades. It ejects so vast a quantity of debris that it carves out a caldera spanning tens of kilometers in width. This eruption hurls an immense volume of particles high into the sky, enough to dim the sunlight. Toba was no ordinary supervolcano. It ranks among the most colossal volcanic occurrences in the past 2 million years. Upon its eventual eruption, it measured a VI8 on the Volcanic Explicity Index. This is the highest possible rating. The scale only reaches 8, with no levels 9 or 10. A VI8 denotes eruptions of such enormous scale and devastating force that they happen roughly once every 50 to 100,000 years. For comparison, Mount St. Helens, still remembered as one of the most destructive volcanic events in recent times, was only a VEI 5. Toba was 5,000 times more powerful, not 5 times, not 50 times, but 5,000 times. At such a scale, the figures start to lose meaning. Toba expelled roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, which equates to 2,800 billion cubic meters. Picture Mount Everest, and then envision the equivalent of 700 Mount Everests in rock, ash, and volcanic rubble hurled into the air within just a few hours. This is the scale we are discussing, yet mere numbers fail to depict the true experience. They cannot express the horror, the turmoil, the world-ending magnitude of events when Toba stirred from its slumber. To truly understand, we must travel back to the days and weeks leading up to the eruption. We must journey to the early inhabitants of Southeast Asia, who were on the brink of enduring the most dreadful day in all of human history. They likely observed the ominous signals. Native communities residing close to active volcanic zones frequently cultivate an innate sense of the Earth's movements. They would have experienced numerous earthquakes, not merely a handful of tremors, but hundreds spread across weeks or months. Initially, mild quakes that were scarcely perceptible, followed by stronger ones, and eventually shaking powerful enough to topple belongings. Any walls they had built would have cracked, causing creatures to scatter in fear. The very earth beneath them began to act in peculiar ways. Ground that had remained firm for countless generations suddenly grew spongy and unstable. Springs that had run pure for ages became hot and sulfurous. Fresh fissures emerged in the ground, releasing hissing steam and poisonous fumes. Trees perished in rings, and lakes heated to levels that wiped out all aquatic life. Creatures would have sensed that something was amiss long before people grasped the situation. Birds deserted their nests, while elephants and other sizable mammals moved away from territories they had inhabited for ages. Insects began to vanish. Every living thing capable of movement was fleeing the volcano. A few humans likely departed as well. The wise and careful ones, who heeded the signs inscribed in the land and heavens, would have collected their families and migrated to more secure locations. They placed as much space as possible between themselves and the cause of the trembling mountains and groaning ground. Yet the majority remained, for humans tend to be hopeful. We adjust. We grow accustomed. Perhaps the shaking would cease. Perhaps the land would calm down. Maybe this upheaval would subside, and existence would revert to its usual rhythm. This place had been their home for countless generations. Their forefathers lay buried in this soil. Leaving would mean surrendering all they had, venturing into unfamiliar lands, and battling for sustenance with other tribes that were not friendly to outsiders. Thus, they remained. And then one day, approximately 74,000 years in the past, the world came to an end. It likely began with a tremor far greater than any prior one. Not the usual trembling they had become used to during the preceding weeks, but a fierce jolt that knocked people down and persisted without cease. The sort of quaking that renders upright posture unfeasible, that tears enormous cracks across the land, that collapses any man-made structures. Then came the noise. Picture the mightiest roar of thunder you have ever experienced. Now magnify that by 1,000 times. The eruption of Toba generated a noise that spread over many thousands of kilometers. Populations as distant as India would have perceived it. They heard it, a deep, rolling rumble that appeared to issue from all directions simultaneously, from the ground itself, swelling ever louder until it became a source of bodily pain, until it transformed from a mere sound into a pressure wave that resonated within one's very marrow. Then the explosion occurred. The full sequence of the eruption may have extended over multiple days, yet the first burst took place in an instant. The immense pressure accumulating under Toba for millennia eventually surpassed the capacity of the rock that held it in. Countless millions of tons of the overlying ground blasted upward and outward at speeds exceeding that of sound. The column of eruption ascended directly into the sky. Not in a slow or gradual manner, but in a sudden explosion that penetrated the cloud cover and continued rising higher and higher. 40 kilometers, then 50 kilometers high, breaking through into the stratosphere. It bore along intensely hot rock, volcanic dust, poisonous fumes, and all other materials that had been held under the earth. At the foot of this pillar, where the volcano once stood, nothing remained but ruin. The peak did not merely crumble, it turned to vapor. The chamber of magma below, previously filled with molten stone under inconceivable pressure, drained within a matter of hours. And once a magma chamber becomes empty, the land above can only sink downward. That is the process by which calderas are created, and the volcano does not just blast outward. It also caves in upon itself, forming an enormous basin, a crater of nearly unimaginable dimensions. Toba's caldera stretched 100 kilometers in length and 30 kilometers in width, a chasm in the ground capable of engulfing whole mountain chains. In the present day, it is flooded with water, creating Lake Toba, among the largest volcanic lakes in the world. Yet 74,000 years ago, it was a smoking, steaming pit filled with intensely hot vapors and ongoing volcanic unrest. But the caldera's creation, however dramatic it may be, was nearly a lesser worry for those in the vicinity. The chief danger was not the cavity that remained. Rather, it was the material emerging from that orifice, pyroclastic flows. Should you be unfamiliar with the phrase, pyroclastic flows rank among nature's most dreadful occurrences. These are cascades of scorching gas, ash, and stone that hurtle down volcanic slopes at velocities above 700 kilometers per hour. They are not streams of lava. Lava travels at a pace slow enough that one can normally outrun it. Pyroclastic flows speed faster than any creature can flee. They are death itself, walls of gas at 700 degrees that burn away all in their way. The pyroclastic flows from Toba were without precedent in their magnitude. They rushed away from the eruption source in every direction, crossing valleys and ascending over hills. It followed the paths of rivers, devouring ancient forests that had remained for millennia. No human could survive within 100 kilometers of the volcano. These currents of destruction advanced with incredible speed, their heat unbearable. There was no refuge, no escape. Those farther off might receive a brief warning, just enough to witness the enormous gray wall bearing down on them. They had the time to understand their fate, to know death was coming, but no time to flee. Beyond the direct destruction of the pyroclastic surges, the eruption unleashed other sudden disasters. The shock wave. The shock wave from the first blast traveled at the speed of sound, leveling forests, demolishing all structures, and triggering avalanches on faraway peaks. The noise alone likely burst eardrums for hundreds of kilometers. Next, the ash began to fall. The volcanic plume, laden with cubic kilometers of ground rock, could not remain suspended indefinitely. Everything that rises must eventually descend. And descend it did, blanketing Southeast Asia, India, the Indian Ocean, and portions of the Middle East and East Africa. Regions nearest to the volcano were buried under meters of ash, whole terrains smothered in gray dust. All vegetation perished, every water supply was poisoned, and any animal too slow to escape was entombed in its tracks. Archaeological findings in India reveal ash deposits from Toba reaching depths of 6 meters in certain places, 6 meters taller than a 2-story building. Picture your entire existence covered by 20 feet of poisonous volcanic matter. Yet, even places with thinner ash experienced catastrophic consequences. A few centimeters may seem insignificant, but volcanic ash bears no resemblance to snow. It never melts. Made of minuscule shards of glass and hazardous minerals, it taints water sources, rendering them unsafe to drink. It blankets plants, rendering them inedible, and when inhaled, leads to respiratory failure. Animals attempting to feed in ash-covered regions perish from intestinal obstructions. The predators that consume them die of hunger, and the ash continued to fall for days, perhaps weeks. Your distance from the eruption determined how each morning you would awake to discover another layer of gray dust covering everything. The ash would bury yesterday's efforts to clear paths, cling to your skin, and invade your eyes, nose, mouth, and lungs. Each breath and movement became an ordeal. Those humans who endured the first explosion and pyroclastic surges now confronted an insurmountable predicament. The heavens had turned black, not the fleeting darkness of night, but an unending gloom. The eruption plume had thrust so much debris into the stratosphere that sunlight could not break through. Noon resembled dusk. Temperatures started falling almost at once. This was not the gradual cooling of winter as we know it. It was an abrupt, severe drop in temperature. Initially, the superheated gases from the eruption had warmed the air, causing strange weather phenomena. Great thunderstorms and heavy rains transformed ash into mudslides. Yet when the gases dissipated and the ash lingered, obstructing the sun, temperatures plunged. In a matter of weeks, places that were once lush tropical havens found themselves gripped by near-freezing conditions. Vegetation unaccustomed to the cold started to wither and perish. Creatures adapted to warmth began to starve, as their sustenance vanished. The whole ecological network unraveled before their eyes. Yet this was only the start. The eruption's immediate devastation, however terrible, was just the first scene. The true calamity had yet to unfold. The unfolding catastrophe was driven by Toba releasing something far more perilous than mere ash: billions of tons of sulfur dioxide from the magma. This gas ascended to the stratosphere, where it combined with water vapor, creating tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. These droplets they formed a reflective veil in the upper atmosphere, a mirror that sent sunlight back into space before it could warm the Earth. The people fighting to survive right after the eruption had no way of knowing this. They simply couldn't have understood. They had no grasp of the atmospheric chemistry sealing their doom. All they understood was that the darkness persisted, the cold grew more severe, ash continued to fall, their children wept from hunger, the game animals had vanished, and the plants were dying. Water sources had become poisonous. They had no idea that this ordeal would stretch on for years. They were simply unaware. They stood at the dawn of a volcanic winter that would challenge human endurance as never before. It was impossible for them to know. It was beyond their imagination that the eruption they had just endured was merely the first trial in a crisis spanning generations. Southeast Asia became utterly impossible to live in. The areas nearest to Toba lay smothered under layers of ash, destined to stay desolate for many decades. Those who survived had a decision to make. They had been distant enough to avoid the direct lethal zone, yet near enough to suffer the ashfall and climatic consequences. Remain and perish, or escape to an unknown refuge. Most opted to flee, for they had little alternative. They journeyed north into India, where the ash layer was thinner. Some went west toward the Middle East, others east toward China. Any path that steered them away from the gray desolation that was once their homeland. Little groups of survivors, bearing meager possessions, abandoned all they had ever known. Yet they would soon realize that the eruption's impact was not confined. The darkness expanded. The cold encircled the globe, and ash descended upon many continents. Wherever they ran, they were racing toward the very calamity they sought to escape. For Toba had not merely laid waste to Southeast Asia. It had set off a global climate emergency that would touch every human community on the planet. The sleeping giant had stirred, and now all of humanity would bear the cost. The people who had survived the eruption, who had eluded the initial ruin, were about to confront something far more terrible. The eruption had ended, but the volcanic winter was only starting. For the following 6 years, the sun would appear only dimly, plants would perish, animals would starve, and humanity would be driven to the very brink of annihilation. The most severe trial in all of human history had begun, and the majority would not survive. The cloud of ash ascended to the stratosphere in under an hour, reaching 28 kilometers high, breaching every atmospheric layer. It spread with such speed that any observer would have been horrified. Yet no one stood at a safe distance to watch. Those close to Toba were already perishing or had passed. Those far enough to live through the first explosion had no inkling of what approached. In just 48 hours, the ash cloud had encircled the equator, and within a week, it had touched both the North and South poles. And after 2 weeks, the entire Earth was swathed in a cover of volcanic debris so dense that midday resembled dusk, and dusk seemed as dark as midnight. Yet the ash was hardly the most dangerous element. Far from it. The true menace lay in sulfur dioxide, a gas invisible to the eye. Into the upper atmosphere, the eruption released 5,000 megatons of this gas. To grasp the scale, Consider that this amount of sulfur surpassed everything produced by human industry in the previous 100 years. All of this was unleashed within just a few hours. At such heights, sulfur dioxide does not remain idle. It combines with water vapor, giving rise to minuscule droplets of sulfuric acid. Countless tons of these droplets hung in the stratosphere, forming a mirror-like layer that would last for years. Sunlight that struck this barrier was reflected away, failing to reach Earth's surface. The planet's energy budget, the fragile equilibrium between incoming solar radiation and outgoing heat, fell into disarray. The Earth's thermostat lay broken beyond repair. Within days, temperatures began to plunge. Initially, the change was barely noticeable. A drop of 1 degree here, perhaps 2 degrees there. At first, people may not have registered the shift, yet it continued relentlessly. Week by week, month by month, the mercury kept descending. Worldwide average temperatures fell by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. That may seem modest, but consider that the gap between today's climate and the last ice age is merely about 5 degrees. This was a cooling event on par with an ice age, yet it unfolded in months rather than millennia. And these figures were merely global averages. Certain areas suffered far more severely. Northern latitudes, already in the final stages of their seasonal cold spells, witnessed temperature plunges of 10, 12, or even 15 degrees Celsius. Regions once blessed with mild winters now confronted Arctic harshness. Areas that were already Arctic turned completely unlivable. Yet it was the events in the tropics that ultimately determined humanity's destiny. These areas were home to most early humans, who thrived in warm, stable, resource-abundant environments that had sustained them for millions of years. Abruptly, these lands endured deadly frosts in Central Africa, in Southeast Asia, in places that had never known temperatures under 15 degrees Celsius. Nighttime temperatures now dipped below freezing. The vegetation perished first, not all at once, but in successive waves. The fast-growing annuals succumbed within a few weeks. Denied sufficient sunlight for photosynthesis, they could no longer maintain themselves. They turned yellow, withered, and fell. Next came the shrubs and small trees, and then, over many months, even the great hardwoods that had endured for centuries started to decline. Their leaves fell prematurely, growth halted, and their root systems gradually died away. Picture yourself strolling through a tropical forest while it slowly dies all around. The vivid greens give way to yellow, then to brown. The canopy grew sparse, allowing a peculiar dim light to filter through the ash-laden sky. The sounds of the forest transformed as animal numbers plummeted, bird calls grew scarce, and insects became rare. A haunting silence crept over everything, punctuated only now and then by the snap of a dying limb or the thunder of a falling tree. The forest did not burn. Perhaps that would have been a kinder fate. Wildfires open up spaces, allowing fresh vegetation to emerge. They return essential elements to the earth. Instead, the woodlands simply decayed, shrouded in chill and dampness. Lifeless plant matter gathered into enormous heaps. In the darkness, fungi thrived, decomposing the fallen debris. Yet no new growth arose to take its place. With the flora gone, every link in the food web disintegrated. The plant-eaters vanished first. The colossal megafauna that once roamed Africa and Asia, the huge elephant-like creatures, the massive browsing mammals, each required immense amounts of foliage daily. As the greenery perished, famine struck in just weeks. They roamed the withering woodlands, growing lean and feeble until collapse. Carcasses lay scattered across the terrain, so abundant that scavengers could not finish them. The lesser herbivores endured for a while more: rodents, tiny antelopes, creatures that lived on seeds and tubers. Yet even these supplies were limited. The plants had ceased yielding fresh seeds, and their root networks were perishing. As months crept by, sustenance grew ever scarcer. Once in the millions, numbers plummeted to thousands, then hundreds, then zero. The hunters accompanied their quarry into extinction. Lions, hyenas, African wild dogs. All of Africa's meat-eaters inhabited a realm devoid of prey. A few attempted constant scavenging, vying with vultures for the decaying flesh of plant-eaters. But those corpses were exhausted. Some predators began hunting their own kind, resorting to desperate cannibalism, yet this merely postponed the unavoidable. Once the herbivores had locally vanished, the carnivores were not far from the same fate. And humanity was trapped in the midst of this horror. They were not herbivores, hence could not live on plants solely, nor were they true carnivores, so they could not rely only on hunting. They were omnivores, relying on a varied mix of plants and meat, and then both food sources were simultaneously fading away. The relics from that era are deeply unsettling. The scant sites we possess from just after the Toba event bear evidence of tremendous hardship. Toolcraft grew more frantic, cruder. Individuals used any available material, no longer choosing the finest. Butchering scars on remains indicate thorough processing, with animal carcasses drained of every edible morsel. Long bones were shattered for marrow, and even craniums were broken open to retrieve the brains. Evidence of dietary deficiency appears on the skeletons themselves, halted growth marks revealing times of acute starvation. Yet the physical clues convey only a fragment of the tale. To truly comprehend the ordeal humans faced in that volcanic winter, one must envision it. Imagine dwelling in a realm that has turned utterly against life. The sun, that steady beacon of light and heat that steered all biological cycles from the dawn of time, has vanished. Not truly gone, but obscured, diminished to a faint gleam that scarcely cuts through the endless murk. Time becomes impossible to measure. Day and night run together indistinguishably. The sole signal that it is day is a minuscule easing of the pitch blackness, while the chill is unyielding. Even near the equator, in lands that had never known winter, the mercury now plunges below freezing each night. You lack sufficient garments, your forebears never required them. You have no dependable fire, and timber is soaked from the ceaseless ash-filled rain descending from the poisonous heavens. Once you succeed in kindling a flame, you must tend it constantly, for igniting another is almost out of the question. For a time, fire holds greater value than sustenance. The pangs of hunger are more unbearable than the chill. In the beginning, there remains some nourishment, foraging among the perishing creatures, collecting the final fruits from trees that are already wilting. Yet within a few months, these supplies are depleted. Now you consume items that your tribe would never have deemed edible. Insects, if you can locate them, bark from trees and roots that could be poisonous, yet consuming them is preferable to consuming nothing. You witness the children wasting away. You see the elders surrender, ceasing to eat so that the younger ones might survive. You perform agonizing assessments of who requires nourishment most urgently, who stands the greatest chance of enduring, and throughout it all, the ash continues to descend. Dense, suffocating clouds of ash. It finds its way into your eyes, your nostrils, your lungs. A gray dust that cannot be washed off covers every surface. When rain falls, and now it falls without pause, the water is corrosive, tainted by sulfurous substances that sting your skin and render it scarcely fit to drink. Blending with rain, the ash forms a dense mire that smothers the terrain. Rivers are clogged with it. Springs and streams grow poisonous. Lung ailments spread rapidly. The tiny ash fragments harm lung tissue, rendering each inhalation agonizing. Infections ensue as all are debilitated by starvation and perpetual exposure to the weather. Defenses within the body fail. Illnesses that a robust individual might repel become fatal judgments. Entire bands likely perished not due to starvation, but from pneumonia, tuberculosis, or contagions that race through starving communities like a blazing fire. Perhaps the most devastating aspect was the mental toll. Human beings are wired to recognize patterns, to grasp cause and consequence, to foresee what lies ahead from what came before. Yet nothing in their collective history had readied them for such a catastrophe. The world had ceased to be as they knew it, and no reason was offered. No means to comprehend the calamity or know when conditions might improve. For all they understood, this was unending. The sunlight had been stolen. The earth would forever be shrouded, frigid, and withering. Certain groups likely surrendered, simply ceased their efforts. When you are freezing, famished, witnessing your children perish, and have no faith that the coming day will be any better than the present, why continue to fight? The innate drive from evolution that compels humans to cling to life against all odds can shatter under enough strain. Melancholy, hopelessness, the quiet choice to cease resistance and allow the gloom to consume you. Yet, not all surrendered. By some means, certain communities discovered the resolve to persist. Moreover, they devised methods to adjust to circumstances that ought to have been uninhabitable. At this point, the narrative shifts from climate to human creativity. For the volcanic winter did not persist indefinitely, yet it endured sufficiently that mere patience was inadequate. Those who endured did not merely bide their time, they innovated. Fresh survival tactics emerged. Certain bands moved, tracking the receding warm areas, journeying toward the equator or to shores where the ocean's heat capacity tempered temperature extremes. These journeys were desperate ventures, trekking for weeks or months across barren terrains, hoping for improved conditions beyond. Numerous migration endeavors likely ended in failure, bands entering regions already claimed by other equally desperate people. Parties exhausting provisions prior to arriving at their goals, companies becoming disoriented in the endless dusk and never locating their path. Yet, certain migrations were successful. We know this from genetic traces indicating population shifts during that era, tiny bands that succeeded in finding refuges, secluded havens where circumstances were marginally less dire, river valleys retaining water, coastal zones where shellfish remained collectible, cave networks offering protection from chill and ashfall. Other communities remained stationary, but fundamentally altered their survival methods. They evolved into dietary experts in manners unknown to their forebears. Certain bands relocated to coasts and grew reliant on ocean resources, fish, mollusks, seals, whatever they could harvest from the sea. Marine habitats were shielded from the volcanic winter more than land-based ones. The sea's vast heat capacity caused water temperatures to decrease at a slower rate. Photosynthesis likely diminished, yet it never ceased completely in the ocean's surface layers. Marine food webs were strained, though not fully shattered. Alternate groups turned into intensive scavengers, trailing the mass deaths of big creatures and subsisting on the leftovers. This was a perilous approach. Rotten flesh could prove fatal. Rivalry with other scavengers, human and beast alike, could turn fierce. Yet for bands adept at swiftly locating and preparing carcasses, this offered an interim sustenance as they devised alternative plans. Furthermore, some groups might have pioneered the first organized storage and preservation methods. At this juncture, the ability to plan for the future and think conceptually turned into a matter of survival. If one could learn to cure meat via smoking or desiccation, one could gather more during the comparatively favorable times. You could extend its use through the lean periods. If you could recognize and keep plant foods that remained edible roots, tubers, nuts, you could establish a safeguard against hunger. This demanded planning months in advance, a cognitively challenging task, yet one at which humans were singularly adept. And amid all this, the social aspects of endurance grew essential. Communities that collaborated, exchanging supplies and wisdom, enjoyed improved odds of survival compared to those that did not. Yet cooperation itself was severely tested throughout this time. In times of scarcity, the urge to gather supplies for one's own kin became nearly irresistible. It is likely that disputes over provisions were a continuous occurrence. Certain communities likely dissolved due to internal conflict, whereas others evolved ways to preserve unity despite immense pressure. The data indicates that the size of a band emerged as a crucial factor because if it grew too large, feeding everyone became impossible. Provisions that could support a score of individuals were insufficient for 50. It is probable that larger assemblies broke apart during this era, dividing into smaller clusters that stood a greater chance of securing adequate sustenance, yet being too small also carried its own risks. A band of just 5 individuals had little protection against misfortune. The loss of a single member meant a fifth of the working strength vanished. Should 2 perish, the entire group might no longer be sustainable. An ideal population likely existed, perhaps between 15 and 25 souls, sizable enough to withstand difficulties, yet small enough to be reliably nourished. Moreover, the volcanic winter did not conclude abruptly. It was not merely 6 years of terror followed by a sudden return to ordinary conditions. The sulfur dioxide lingering in the stratosphere required somewhere between 6 and 10 years to dissipate. Over that span, temperatures started to climb slowly, and the endless murk began to clear bit by bit. Sunbeams began to pierce the veils of ash, feeble initially, then growing more robust. However, the harm was already inflicted. Ecosystems that had crumbled could not restore themselves in a single night. Forests require many years to regenerate, and even longer for certain other elements. Populations of sizable animals needed generations to rebound, and intricate food webs took countless years to reform. Furthermore, the climate did not simply revert to what it was before the eruption. The enormous release of volcanic gases had changed the composition of the atmosphere, and those alterations lasted for centuries. After the volcanic winter came a millennium of cooler temperatures. This was less drastic than the direct aftermath of the blast, yet it was notably chillier than the conditions that had preceded the eruption. Samples taken from ice dating to that epoch reveal temperature fluctuations that must have rendered survival exceedingly challenging. Periods of moderate warmth, lasting decades, were succeeded by chilly decades. Rainfall became erratic, and the times for planting varied from one generation to the next. Those human communities that managed to endure the volcanic winter then encountered a fresh difficulty. They had become accustomed to catastrophic scenarios, having devised methods for enduring the most dire situations imaginable. Yet they were required to adjust once more, this time to protracted upheaval. This was not one isolated disaster, but a continuous unpredictability, with no certainty whether the coming year would bring warmth or chill, moisture or drought, plenty or want. It was this extended era of fluctuation that truly sealed the genetic bottleneck. The volcanic winter eliminated the great bulk of humanity, yet the subsequent 1,000 years of cold kept the number of humans low, with crashes occurring every several generations. Further climatic upheavals would strike, causing temperatures to fall, rains to cease, and food supplies to crumble. With each occurrence, human numbers plummeted anew. Only those bands that had cultivated the most adaptable means of survival managed to persevere. These were the groups that could swiftly shift from one food source to another, and those that could relocate without delay whenever circumstances altered. The communities that invented novel tools when age-old techniques failed, and that preserved social harmony despite immense strain. Across that millennium, the process of natural selection stripped away all that was not utterly vital for enduring unpredictable environments. Attributes such as sheer physical strength, highly specialized traits for particular habitats, and inflexible conduct were all weeded out. Every one of those characteristics was disfavored. What persisted was a tiny community of humans who were extraordinarily versatile and ingenious, capable of withstanding nearly any hardship. Yet the truly astonishing aspect is this: they did not merely endure, they retained their knowledge. Evidence unearthed by archaeologists indicates that the craft of creating tools endured throughout the bottleneck. Wisdom regarding fire, building shelters, and methods of hunting, all such expertise was kept alive and transmitted across generations, even when the number of people dwindled to almost none. Cultural knowledge outlasted entire groups of people. This reveals a deep insight into what set these survivors apart. They did not adapt merely on their own. They evolved as a whole, communities capable of safeguarding and passing on. Wisdom passed down through the ages provided survival benefits that those lacking these skills could not achieve. The long volcanic winter favored those with abilities in social learning, instruction, and speech. They possessed the ability to communicate which survival methods succeeded and which marvels failed. When the millennium-long cold spell eventually concluded, roughly 69,000 years in the past, humanity had passed through a trial like no other creature had ever faced. They were the offspring of the most flexible, inventive, and cooperative people from a group that had already shrunk to the tiniest possible size. Within their DNA and shared traditions lay the teachings from the harshest endurance challenge in all of human existence, and soon they would spread rapidly across the globe. Yet before we explore that outward spread, we must grasp precisely how the population squeeze impacted human heredity. For the volcanic winter did not merely eliminate the majority of people, it radically reshaped our genetic code. Proof of this genetic alteration remains apparent in every person living now. In 1995, a Stanford University researcher uncovered something that would transform our entire understanding of human origins. That scientist was Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, and his work seemed quite simple. He was examining human DNA collected from communities across the Earth. He anticipated discovering what one would see in any thriving species scattered over several continents: great amounts of genetic variation. Distinct groups with unique features molded by countless generations of regional adjustment. People in Africa genetically separate from those in Asia, and Europeans, unlike both, while Native Americans bore distinctive genetic marks from their long isolation over thousands of years. But that is not what he observed. Instead, he stumbled upon something that seemed entirely irrational. Humanity, though dwelling on 6 continents, comprising billions of people, and inhabiting almost every environment from polar ice fields to humid jungles, possessed surprisingly low genetic variety. In truth, our species had an alarmingly small amount of genetic difference. This was the sort of limited diversity one would anticipate from a species that had recently been driven to the edge of annihilation. Other scientists started investigating further, and the same consistent trend appeared. Regardless of which DNA segments they studied or which groups they selected, the outcome remained identical. Every person across the globe was astonishingly kin, far more related than could be expected. And then the truly astonishing revelation arrived. When researchers contrasted human genetic variety with that of our nearest animal cousins, the figures grew utterly strange. One group of chimpanzees residing in a single Tanzanian forest possessed greater genetic variation than the entire human population of 8 billion. A band of only a few hundred gorillas in the Congo displayed more genetic diversity than all people spread from Alaska to Australia. This was not merely peculiar. It was a warning sign, as vast as an entire continent. Species do not normally possess such scant genetic variation, not thriving species that have been expanding for eons. The sole situation where such genetic patterns emerge is when a species has endured what experts call a population bottleneck, a disastrous collapse in numbers that erases most of the genetic variation, leaving only a small fraction to restore the whole species. Some catastrophic event had almost annihilated humankind, and it had taken place not long ago, certainly by evolutionary standards. An urgent quest began to determine exactly when this bottleneck happened and just how extreme it was. Scientists started focusing on particular DNA types that are exceptionally helpful in tracking humanity's past. The initial major discovery emerged from the study of mitochondrial DNA. This genetic information is inherited solely from the maternal side. Each person's mitochondrial DNA matches their mother's, which in turn matched her mother's, stretching back through countless generations. Gradual changes build up in mitochondrial DNA, functioning as a natural timepiece that allows researchers to follow ancestral lines into the past. When scientists charted the mitochondrial DNA branches of individuals across the globe, every single one led back to a shared forebear, a single woman who dwelled in Africa roughly between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The press named this woman mitochondrial Eve, and suddenly all were discussing the ancestral mother of humankind. Yet this is where the tale takes a fascinating turn. The evidence revealed another detail, one that contradicted the gradual evolutionary narrative we had learned. Approximately 70,000 years ago, the mitochondrial DNA lineages displayed a sudden constriction. The vast majority of genetic variation that ought to have built up over millennia simply vanished. It resembled observing a great river abruptly channeled into a tight gorge, with nearly all its water disappearing. Next, scientists examined Y chromosome DNA, which follows paternal lines, just as mitochondrial DNA tracks maternal ones. They discovered an identical pattern. Every human Y chromosome pointed back to a single forefather, known as Y chromosomal Adam, who existed roughly between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Then, precisely around 70,000 years ago, a second severe constriction occurred. genetic variety shrank to a tiny fraction before gradually broadening once more. All the clues were aligning. Both female and male ancestral lines indicated an identical devastating population decline 70,000 years ago, coinciding exactly with the eruption of Toba. Yet just how drastic was this narrowing? How near did humankind approach total annihilation? Here the figures become deeply alarming. Through comparing the genetic variation present in today's humans with the speed at which fresh mutations arise, scientists were able to estimate how many reproducing individuals made it through the bottleneck. The estimates fluctuated based on the genetic markers examined and the mathematical frameworks employed, yet each led to the same chilling outcome. The worldwide human numbers plummeted to a range of 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. Worse still, some projections fell even lower, hinting at maybe just 1,000 mating pairs. This is not 1,000 humans per continent or per nation. It is 1,000 pairs for the whole species, across the entire Earth. Each person alive now, all 8 billion of us, originates from that small surviving group. Contemplate what that signifies. Your forebears, no matter your family's roots, belonged to that community. That entire group could have been accommodated in a present-day sports arena with space left over. Such was our proximity to becoming part of the 99% of all species that have lived and later vanished. Yet the genetic data disclosed something even more extraordinary. The population didn't merely collapse, it remained diminished for millennia. This was no short-lived catastrophe with swift revival. The genetic pattern indicated that the human numbers stayed perilously small for a span of 10,000 to 100,000 years following the first bottleneck. This is not a one-time disaster. It represents an extended ordeal of survival that outlasted the entirety of written human records. Across countless generations, our forefathers and foremothers existed on the brink of vanishing. Any further calamity, an epidemic, a drought, or strife among bands might have sealed their fate. That we exist today signifies those who endured were either extraordinarily fortunate or exceptionally clever, or most probably, both repeatedly over thousands of ancestral generations. The genetic traces manifest in other patterns as well. Every human being alive today shares certain genetic markers, which were carried by that small surviving group after the Great Ordeal. We all possess these traits because our lineage traces back to those who endured the disaster. A particularly captivating instance concerns the FOXP2 gene, essential for speech and communication. Across the globe, people carry nearly identical copies of this gene, with variations that seem to have been favored by natural selection during the population decline. This implies that in the midst of the struggle for existence, clear communication turned into a vital skill. Those bands, able to organize their efforts, exchange details about supplies and hazards, and teach intricate wisdom to their offspring, greatly outmatched those that could not. Over countless centuries of harsh existence, evolution sharpened our capacity for language at a pace that would ordinarily require eons. Additionally, this genetic narrowing accounted for several unusual aspects. Oddities within our DNA that long confused scientists now made sense. Our species possesses surprisingly little genetic diversity when compared to other animals. Typically, animal groups gather many strange genetic changes present in just a handful of members. Such uncommon variations serve as evolution's building blocks, offering the flexibility needed to face new obstacles. We humans have only a handful of these. The reason? As the population dwindled, many unusual mutations were lost forever. Imagine being among merely 10,000 people alive. You possess a unique genetic variation shared only with your immediate family and a small circle of kin. Should your clan fail to endure the volcanic winter, that distinctive trait disappears permanently. Extend this loss over many genes and numerous generations, and the result is a species with an exceptionally consistent genetic makeup. Yet the narrative becomes more intricate here. Not every researcher agrees that the Toba eruption was the sole cause of this population decline. The chronology aligns nearly flawlessly with an event 70 millennia in the past. The intensity of the human numbers plunge fits the pattern of a massive volcanic winter. Physical traces confirm the eruption's catastrophic nature. However, coincidence does not prove cause, and certain scientists suspect the genetic record may hint at something else. A key difficulty lies within the imprecision of the molecular clock. Claiming the bottleneck occurred 70,000 years ago carries a possible deviation of 20 millennia, or even greater. Various research efforts, employing distinct genetic indicators, occasionally yield dates spanning from 50 to 100,000 years ago for the identical demographic crash. Not all of these timeframes match neatly with the Toba explosion. Moreover, it is uncertain whether a single occurrence, even a colossal volcano, could truly shrink the world's human numbers to mere thousands. Skeptics note that our ancestors inhabited Africa, Europe, and Asia during that era. For a single disaster to nearly erase communities on 3 continents at once would demand environmental consequences of an extreme never witnessed before. Several scientists have offered different theories. Perhaps the population decline resulted not from a sudden calamity, but from an extended stretch of severe climatic upheaval. Between 70 and 60,000 years ago, the Ice Age brought severe, frigid intervals. Maybe the worldwide human community was gradually pressured by advancing ice sheets, reduced livable areas, and diminishing food supplies across many centuries. Another possibility is the impact of illness. A widespread epidemic moving through tiny, dispersed bands might have wiped out community after community, sparing only a few scattered individuals. The DNA patterns would resemble those left by an ecological disaster, yet the underlying cause would differ entirely. Additionally, the idea of multiple cataclysms exists. It is possible that humanity encountered not just a single, but multiple brushes with extinction, one after the other. The Toba eruption brought sudden ruin, and as groups were still trying to recover, another climatic catastrophe struck. After that came epidemics and struggles over dwindling supplies. Each occurrence further eroded genetic variation, leaving only the most resilient, fortunate, or adaptable communities. Though scholars still argue over details, there is one point on which all concur. Around 70,000 years ago, our ancestors experienced a terrible catastrophe. The genetic proof leaves no room for doubt. The human species underwent a drastic population decline, shrinking our genetic variety to a degree normally found only in species on the brink of vanishing. Whether the Toba eruption was the main trigger, a partial cause, or merely a coincidence in time, the outcome remained unchanged. Humans teetered on the edge of annihilation. Yet the genetic record reveals a deeper truth, one even more significant than the narrow escape itself. That evidence shows the remarkable oneness of all humankind. Each individual now living is connected to every other by forebears who existed merely 2,000 to 3,000 generations in the past. In evolutionary time, that is almost negligible, a mere instant. When scientists map genealogies using DNA from global communities, they discover that any 2 people chosen at random anywhere on Earth are no more distant than 50th cousins. The majority are far closer kin. For example, if your roots are European, you have common ancestors with all other Europeans from the past millennium. Going back just 3 to 4 centuries, every living person, regardless of heritage, shares at least a single common ancestor. This is astonishing to consider, especially given the genetic variations we tend to emphasize: pigmentation, facial structure, hair type. These traits are remarkably shallow differences that arose only in the past several tens of millennia as groups adjusted to diverse environments. Beneath these external distinctions, each of us bears the genetic inheritance of those who endured the bottleneck. We all belong to one vast family, all stemming from the same tiny band that would not allow our species to perish. The genetic clues also reveal the location where those survivors made their home. The greatest genetic variety among present-day humans exists in African populations, especially those of southern and eastern Africa. That indicates that the main havens from the bottleneck, where the largest numbers of people endured, were in those regions. It is possible that other small, isolated pockets of humans survived elsewhere, but the core storehouse of human genetic variation persisted in Africa. This is logical when considering the probable effects of the Toba eruption. Africa, especially its equatorial and southern areas, would have been farthest from the volcano. Although ash and global cooling touched every continent, communities in Africa likely suffered less immediate destruction than those nearer the blast in Southeast Asia. They would have enjoyed extra time to adjust, greater opportunities to seek shelter, and improved odds of sustaining healthy population numbers, yet they still endured catastrophic loss. Even those groups farthest from the event, most shielded from its immediate consequences, and best equipped to survive, still saw the majority of their genetic variation vanish. This reveals that the Toba winter was not merely severe, it was a global catastrophe nearly beyond our grasp. This population crash also accounts for why humans display so little physical diversity compared to other species that inhabit vast regions. For example, bears on different continents appear dramatically unlike one another. Asian and African elephants are distinct species, yet humans, originating from Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas, after many tens of millennia apart, can all mate and bear fertile young. We remain fundamentally one species, as we all share descent from a single, relatively recent ancestral community. Newer genetic investigations employing sophisticated sequencing methods have uncovered further insights into the bottleneck and its consequences. Scientists can now pinpoint particular genes that display signs of having been favored during and after the population collapse. These are genes where specific versions became almost ubiquitous among humans, hinting that they offered vital benefits for survival throughout the ordeal. A number of these genes play a role in immune response, indicating that resistance to disease was essential throughout that constricted era. Meanwhile, other genes influence metabolism, especially the capacity to utilize a variety of food sources effectively. When one's typical food vanishes beneath layers of volcanic debris and climatic upheaval, the skill to derive nourishment from different options turns into a vital survival necessity. Additional genes are tied to brain growth and mental abilities. This backs up the notion that cleverness, capacity for resolving challenges, and collaborative behavior were decisive in deciding which individuals lived and which perished. This genetic crunch was not a matter of chance. It was not mere misfortune that wiped out 90% or more of the human population. Instead, it was a harsh process of natural selection that gave advantage to particular characteristics, and those characteristics remain present in us now. Possibly, the greatest revelation from this genetic data is that every one of us is descendants of those who endured. This is not a figure of speech, but a factual reality. Each human being currently walking the earth possesses genetic material that passed through the most extreme trial of endurance in our species' past. Your forebears, regardless of their identity, consider that past. Your predecessors, no matter who they were, no matter where they dwelled, managed to endure when the planet became shadowy, frigid, and lethal. They endured when nourishment grew scarce. They endured when societies that had thrived for countless millennia crumbled. They endured when their neighbors, their competitors, and likely a majority of their own relatives perished. These individuals were the most resilient, most intelligent, most fortunate, or most collaborative within their communities. They were those who discovered means to locate sustenance amid the gloom. They were the ones who sustained their loved ones through interminable winters. They were the individuals who kept hope alive when every sign pointed to the end of human existence. And then, when that prolonged volcanic chill eventually lifted and the earth started to heal, they were the people who restored civilization. Across 70 millennia and 2,000 generations, they transmitted their genes for endurance, their flexibility, their capacity to adjust, and their resolve all the way to you. That constitutes your inherited genetic legacy. This is inscribed within each cell of your being. You are the outcome of the most remarkable tale of perseverance in the annals of humanity. Indeed, the proof is physically encoded in your deoxyribonucleic acid, yet the narrative does not conclude with mere survival. For what occurred afterward, what that small group of survivors accomplished as the world began to rebound, would decide not only if humans endured, but also if we would flourish, spread, and ultimately come to rule over the whole earth. That constriction in genetic diversity had produced a phenomenon never before seen in evolution: a species possessing strikingly homogeneous genetic makeup, a species that had been honed by the harshest conceivable process of natural selection. Moreover, a species on the verge of erupting across the planet in a surge of growth that would completely remake the world. Those who endured had weathered the catastrophe. Now they were prepared to demonstrate what they could accomplish when granted another opportunity. Following 6 years of shadow, as the volcanic chill at last started to loosen its hold, the survivors came forth into a planet that had changed almost beyond comprehension. Yet a question troubles anthropological researchers persistently. Where exactly were those roughly 280 people located while the broader world turned icy? And even more crucially, how did they manage to stay alive when almost all others perished? The response is recorded in stone implements, genetic signatures, and the isolated archaeological remnants that denote humanity's most somber period. These survivors were not spread haphazardly across the planet. Instead, they gathered in particular safe havens locations where a singular mix of circumstances formed small enclaves of habitability in an otherwise barren world. The principal refuge was in East Africa, the very area where humanity first arose, now transformed into our final haven. Yet it was not the entire expanse of East Africa. Those who survived were clustered along the East African Rift Valley, a geological fissure stretching from Ethiopia down through Kenya and Tanzania, forming an exceptional habitat found nowhere else on Earth. This Rift Valley provided a crucial advantage, a variety of elevations. In just a few days of walking, one could transition from lofty plateaus to low-lying valleys, from arid savannas to wooded highlands. When the volcanic winter laid waste to the land, you could seek safety by climbing to higher ground. When frost killed the highland plants, you could move down into valleys that remained a little warmer. Yet that alone was insufficient. The Rift Valley's true uniqueness came from its geological activity. It remains one of the most volcanically and seismically active areas on Earth. And that volcanic activity brought something essential. Geothermal warmth, hot springs, heated caves, and places where the planet's inner heat emerged through the ground formed microclimates. Such microclimates stayed livable even when the surrounding world was frozen solid. Present-day archaeological investigations have uncovered settlement sites from the Toba period that are concentrated near these geothermal spots. Our forebears literally gathered close to the Earth's heat, while the exterior world turned to ice. Consider the significance of this. The remainder of humankind was spread throughout Africa and Asia, perishing as their surroundings fell apart. A handful of tiny bands happened upon the only kind of place that could support human existence. They had no idea they were seeking geothermal zones. They were simply wandering, frantically seeking any spot that provided cover and heat, and a few of them, by sheer luck, discovered such a place. There is also proof of another haven in South Africa, especially along the coast. Cave locations like Pinnacle Point reveal uninterrupted human habitation throughout the Toba period. Those who survived adopted an alternative approach. They looked to the sea. As land-based ecosystems crumbled, ocean environments suffered less from the volcanic winter. The seas possess immense thermal capacity. They do not lose heat swiftly. While temperatures on land plunged, coastal waters remained fairly stable, and this meant sustenance: shellfish, fish, seals, and kelp. The shoreline of South Africa provided a cushion of provisions that could support small groups even when hunting and gathering on land grew impossible. Archaeological findings from that era indicate a sharp rise in the use of marine resources. Shell heaps, fish bones, and implements crafted for preparing seafood have been discovered. The people who survived along the coast were engaging in an activity novel to human history. They were transforming into expert marine gatherers, acquiring the knowledge and tools to harvest a completely new source of food. It was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. The land had let them down, and only the sea remained. Yet both communities, whether gathered near the hot springs of East Africa or taking refuge in the coastal caves of South Africa, confronted the same harsh truth. The landscape beyond their sanctuaries was lethal. They could not venture far from their secure areas. They could no longer pursue migrating animal herds, for there were none to follow. They could not collect edible plants from vast expanses, as the vegetation had perished. They were caught, restricted to small islands of survivability within an icy desert, and this restriction generated evolutionary forces never before encountered. Let us consider what day-to-day existence was like during those prolonged years of gloom. For grasping the particular hardships endured by these individuals allows us to comprehend the changes they underwent, the characteristics that would ultimately distinguish us from all other human species that had ever lived. To begin with, shelter. In the harsh conditions of a volcanic winter, lacking it leads to death. Exposure proves fatal within hours, not days. Our forebears turned to living in caves, compelled by survival rather than preference. Remains from that era indicate caves were inhabited on a semi-permanent basis. These were not fleeting overnight stops. They served as continuous homes for years, possibly even decades. Yet caves bring their own difficulties. They are chilly, dark, and frequently moist. Without proper care for airflow, particularly when fires are kept going relentlessly, they can turn into deadly hazards. Those who endured needed to master cave management. They had to arrange fires for optimal warmth while reducing smoke accumulation. They learned where to rest, to preserve heat, without risking carbon monoxide poisoning. Also, how to maintain. The cave mouth had to be kept secure from predators that were likewise looking for refuge. Next came fire. This was not a choice. Deprived of fire, you would freeze. Without fire, food cannot be cooked. Moreover, in times of food shortage, the ability to draw the utmost nutrition from any available source turns into a critical survival issue. The survivors grew fixated on keeping fires alive. Findings from excavations reveal fireplaces that remained lit for years. This is not about discussing the mere act of kindling a fresh fire each night. No, this is about sustaining flames that were never allowed to die, safeguarding embers with devout dedication, for extinguishing a fire might lead to the loss of everything. Consider the immense logistical effort this required. A person had to watch the fire without interruption. Another had to collect fuel. During that volcanic winter, wood was hard to come by and frequently damp. Likely they used bone, parched grass, animal fat, any material capable of generating warmth. They devised methods to preserve flames through spells of rain or times when fuel was unavailable. Keeping fire going in such circumstances demanded foresight, teamwork, and likely some ceremonial practices. Numerous anthropologists believe that this era marked the point when tending fire took on a ceremonial role in human societies. It was far too crucial to be left to luck. It needed safeguarding through social codes, appointed fire watchers, and customs that guaranteed the fire never expired. The third priority was hunting. The megafauna that had formerly supplied dependable sustenance were perishing. The enormous herds that our predecessors had pursued for millennia had vanished. They succumbed to starvation from the dearth of plant life, or were killed by the unimaginable cold. Yet a few creatures endured, and the humans who lived on had to locate them. The archaeological evidence reveals an extraordinary development. Stone implements from the Tabor period, and the era right after it grew considerably more advanced. Composite tools began to appear, weapons constructed from several components, meticulously assembled. Spear tips attached using plant resin and sinew produced projectile weapons that were more lethal, more dependable, and simpler to mend. This was not a slow, gradual technological change. It was swift invention born of immense urgency. When each hunting expedition is critical, and any unsuccessful outcome means your family goes hungry, you become exceptionally skilled at crafting functional weapons. Those who survived turned into expert hunters, not due to innate talent, but because the only other option was dying. Additionally, they began to hunt with greater strategy. Rather than trailing herds in a haphazard manner, they learned to anticipate the migrations of animals, pinpointing the scarce locations where prey might gather. Waterholes, mineral deposits, the isolated pockets of remaining flora, they developed fresh approaches to interpreting the terrain, adopting the mindset of the creatures they pursued. They began to develop cooperative hunting methods that demanded a level of coordination never seen before. Bringing down a mammoth or a woolly rhinoceros with spears tipped in stone required flawless timing, careful positioning, and deep trust among all involved. Should a single hunter make an error, the entire group would perish. If one person lost their nerve, the hunt would be doomed. Those who survived cultivated coordination skills that far surpassed what their forebears had ever accomplished. Now, consider plant foods. In discussions of human survival, hunting tends to receive all the focus. Yet plants have always formed the foundation of human nourishment. The issue was that during the volcanic winter, vegetation perished. However, not all plants died, nor in every location. The survivors became skilled botanists. They discovered which plants could endure dim light and frigid conditions. They learned to make use of underground storage organs, roots, and tubers that stayed alive even after the surface plants had withered. They mastered techniques to render poisonous plants safe, plants their ancestors had steered clear of, by using fire and water to remove toxins, thereby broadening what they could eat. Excavations reveal that tools for such processing became increasingly widespread. Grinding stones, pounding rocks, and implements crafted, especially to break down plant matter that was inedible in its raw state. These indicate that our forebears devoted considerable effort to processing vegetation in order to obtain every available calorie. They also likely stored food using methods earlier humans had not thought to employ. In times of plenty, there is no need to think ahead. But when each meal is uncertain, storing provisions becomes a matter of life and death. Archaeological evidence from this era points to organized food preservation, drying meat and fish, storing nuts and seeds. Such hidden supplies could support a band through times when hunting and foraging were not possible. But this is where matters become truly fascinating. All these adaptations for survival, managing caves, maintaining fires, advanced hunting, botanical expertise, processing, and storing food. None of these strategies would succeed without flawless cooperation within the group. The population bottleneck had its most significant evolutionary impact here. With groups so small, everyone was familiar with everyone else. There was no place to hide, no opportunity to shirk, no chance to deceive. Because if you did any of those things, the whole group, yourself included, might perish. Game theorists refer to this as extreme cooperation in the face of existential danger. When staying alive demands flawless synchrony, natural selection gives advantage to those who cooperate well. Those who share provisions, collaborate effectively, communicate clearly, empathize with others, and prioritize the group's survival over personal gain. These are the cooperative individuals. The selfish ones, those who hoarded or refused to collaborate, saw their groups perish. They left behind no offspring. Those who collaborated, who exchanged knowledge and resources, and who forged powerful social ties endured. They transmitted not only their genes, but also their cooperative tendencies to their descendants. At this juncture, human psychology underwent a fundamental shift. We evolved into the most cooperative, large-scale species on Earth. We cooperate more than any other primate, more than pack hunters such as wolves or orcas. We cultivated a nearly unparalleled capacity to partner with non-kin, to ally with strangers, and to synchronize efforts across extensive communities. And it all began in these small refugee bands where flawless cooperation was the only route to survival. There is another factor that many overlook: language. We touched on communication earlier, but it was likely during this bottleneck that human language achieved its true sophistication and modernity. Consider the communicative hurdles these survivors encountered. They had to orchestrate intricate hunts. They had to instruct children in complex abilities, tending fires, crafting tools, identifying plants, and reading tracks. Essential knowledge about faraway places had to be exchanged where food could be found, where threats hid, which water sources remained usable. Additionally, they had to preserve social bonds amid extreme strain. In the grip of cold, hunger, and fear, social connections can quickly unravel. Disputes emerge around resources, about what seems equitable, and over who is contributing their share. If they lacked advanced ways to communicate, such conflicts might split communities apart. But language served as the binding force that united survivor groups. Being able to explain, convince, resolve disputes, and share tales that strengthened group identity and teamwork was crucial. In those circumstances, even small advancements in linguistic skill offered enormous benefits for survival. Those who could speak with clarity, grasp subtlety, and employ language to reinforce social ties helped their community endure. Across countless generations, this evolutionary pressure shaped human language to a degree unmatched by any other species. Some scholars believe this was the era when humans acquired the complete range of linguistic capabilities we now have. Grammar became sufficiently sophisticated to convey notions that are abstract, adequate to record intricate technical understanding, the mental agility to quickly acquire new terms and ideas, the social awareness to wield language tactically, to forge relationships, to instruct, to guide. Those who endured were no longer only exchanging messages. They were conversing, truly conversing, in manners that would be familiar to people today. Yet maybe the most crucial change was in the mind. The survivors cultivated what experts refer to as resilience under pressure and a forward-looking mindset. They needed to keep performing amid unrelenting strain. Without collapsing, they had to remain capable of preparing for later, to postpone immediate pleasure in favor of choices guided by future outcomes instead of urgent wants. This marks a profound transformation in human thinking. Earlier people, much like other creatures, existed, mostly in the here and now. They reacted to pressing demands and chances. Those who survived the bottleneck were compelled to reason. In a different way, they had to envision coming events, prepare for possibilities, create. Choices of great strategy may bring no immediate reward, taking weeks or even months to unfold. The one who devoured all the provisions might feel content this evening, yet tomorrow their community would face starvation. The person who kept the fire burning, even in utter exhaustion, ensured their family endured the next cold snap. When exhaustion overtook them, they made certain their family survived the following period of freezing weather. One who shared their catch, even while hungry, built bonds that would later rescue them. This forward-looking, strategic mindset became deeply ingrained in human psychology. We became the species that plans, that envisions, and trades present comfort for future gain. This began as a survival mechanism during humanity's most dire era. Healing came with agonizing slowness. Even after the volcanic winter ended, the skies cleared and temperatures rose, the world remained devastated. Ecosystems do not recover overnight. Forests need decades to regrow. Grasslands take years to heal. The animal populations wiped out by the die-off required many generations to rebuild. Archaeological clues suggest the first few thousand years after Toba were nearly as harsh as the volcanic winter itself. Resources stayed scarce. Competition for what little existed was fierce. Survivor populations remained tiny, likely never exceeding a few hundred individuals in any given region. Yet, something had changed within those survivors. The qualities that carried them through the crisis, cooperation, innovation, communication, strategic thinking, were not temporary. They had become fundamental to human nature. Slowly and painfully, the population began to grow. Groups once confined to tiny refuges began exploring beyond their safe zones. They found conditions, though still harsh, were improving. They discovered new areas with recovering resources. They spread, but not randomly. The survivors passed down knowledge, traditions, and survival techniques refined during the crisis. Children learned from parents who had learned from grandparents who had lived through the darkness. This intergenerational transfer created a cultural continuity earlier humans never achieved. Stone tool traditions developed during the bottleneck persisted for thousands of years. Hunting techniques perfected under pressure continued in use. Social structures born from the need for cooperation became standard. Even psychological traits, stress tolerance, future thinking, cooperative impulses were reinforced by culture and passed down through teaching as well as genes. By around 60,000 years ago, when modern humans finally left Africa to meet their evolutionary cousins, they carried every adaptation from the bottleneck. They were cooperation machines, innovation engines, communication experts. They could adapt quickly to new environments, develop new technologies rapidly, and form large social networks with ease. The Neanderthals and Denisovans they encountered were also descendants of bottleneck survivors. They too were intelligent, cooperative, and technologically adept. But the African population, having stayed in a climatically unstable homeland and faced ongoing challenges for another, 10,000 years after their cousins had settled into stable European and Asian environments, retained one crucial advantage: flexibility. When modern humans spread across the world, they brought the survivor mentality forged in Toba's fire. They encountered new environments and adapted. They faced fresh challenges and innovated. They met other human species, and while there was certainly conflict, they also cooperated enough to interbreed, share knowledge, and sometimes coexist. Yet, in the end, it was the descendants of those African refuge populations who prevailed not because they were stronger, nor because they were innately smarter. Yet, it was because they bore within their DNA and traditions the wisdom of enduring during humanity's most harrowing time. Now, every person walking the earth carries the genetic imprint of that population crunch. Every one of us traces our lineage back to those 280 individuals who refused to succumb. The characteristics they possessed are now ours. The survival strategies they developed have become our legacy. That instinct to collaborate with unfamiliar faces, that's the spirit of the bottleneck survivor within you. When you make plans for tomorrow, you're drawing upon the legacy of that volcanic winter. When you create, adjust, or converse, you are employing skills that were sharpened under the most intense strain our kind has ever known. Those who made it through had no awareness that they were molding the destiny of humankind. They simply aimed to survive one more day, to keep their flames alive, to gather sufficient nourishment for their young. They sought to preserve the connections that kept their communities united. But by persisting, by declining to surrender even as their world crumbled, they forged something never seen before. They gave rise to us, contemporary humans, the species that endured the unendurable, adapted to the unadaptable, and ultimately came to rule a whole world. We are each and every one of us survivors, and the qualities that rescued our forebears 70 millennia ago continue to protect us in the present. Those survivors were unaware that they had lived through something without precedent. They had no way of realizing that their numbers had dwindled to merely 10,000 people. They had no understanding of population bottlenecks or events leading to extinction. All they understood was that life had grown overwhelmingly difficult, that their elders recalled tales of easier days. Each day was a fight against hunger, chill, and shadow. Yet they pressed onward, and somehow, defying probabilities that ought to have been unbeatable, that 10,000 grew to 20,000, then 40,000, then 80,000. The rebound was gradual, agonizingly gradual. For millennia following Toba, the human population increased only slightly above the rate needed to sustain itself. The climate continued to fluctuate. Resources stayed sparse. The world that Toba had forged was a severe instructor, and it had not finished challenging humankind. Yet a transformation had occurred within those who endured. The population crunch did not merely diminish their count, it honed them, choosing the most flexible, inventive, and robust qualities encoded in human DNA. Every living human traced their origin back to the tiny band that had succeeded in surviving the most severe ecological disaster in our species' past. They bore that inheritance within their genetic code and were poised to employ it to dominate the globe. Roughly 60,000 years ago, some 10,000 years after the explosion, an extraordinary event occurred. A modest band of people, perhaps only a few hundred in number, chose a path that would alter everything, and they departed from Africa. This was not the initial occasion that humans had journeyed outside the continent. Prior groups of Homo erectus had dispersed into Asia and Europe millions of years earlier. However, those prior movements largely ended in failure or led to distinct lineages such as the Neanderthals and Denisovans. But now, things were about to change. The band of humans who departed Africa some 60 millennia ago bore a gift that earlier generations had lacked. They emerged as the refined outcome of that genetic pinch, armed with every survival tactic that had been mercilessly honed across those desperate post-Toba millennia. Their minds were sharper, their ways of communicating more effective, their tools more ingenious, and above all, they possessed a flexibility never seen before. It was into the Arabian Peninsula that they first stepped. The climate had altered just sufficiently to open a slender passage of chance, where once there were barren desert coastlines, now lay feasible paths for their journey. Those early adventurers hugged the shore, making use of the sea's bounty, slowly widening the boundaries of their world. In just a few thousand years, their footsteps reached India and then Southeast Asia. By 50,000 years ago, they had set foot on Australian soil. Pause and consider that. Australia. To arrive there demanded advanced shipcraft and the art of steering by stars and currents. Such a feat called for forethought, teamwork, and the bravery to push across oceans that no one before had dared. These people were more than simple survivors now. They had become discoverers, inventors, future rulers of the globe. Meanwhile, other bands moved northward into the Middle East and farther still. Roughly 45,000 years in the past, anatomically modern humans entered Europe in great numbers. Here they came face to face with their evolutionary kindred, the Neanderthals, who had called that land home for hundreds of millennia. The encounter of modern humans and Neanderthals ranks among the most compelling tales of our ancestry. For many years, researchers painted it as a clash, a brutal takeover in which the more advanced humans annihilated their simpler relatives. Yet the information held in our genes reveals a subtler truth. They did not only battle, they also mingled and mated. Now, if your ancestry lies outside Africa, roughly 2% of your genetic makeup originates from Neanderthals. This is the enduring trace of unions between our kind, forged 40 to 50,000 years ago. Evidence that when our ancestors met other human lineages, at least on occasion, they beheld not foes but possible companions. However, cooperation has boundaries, and now the narrative takes a more intricate turn. Here, the looming shadow of the Toba eruption continues to fall across humanity's past. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal numbers were already dwindling. By 30,000 years ago, they had become confined to a handful of strongholds in southern Europe. By 28,000 years ago, they had vanished completely, gone forever. Why did this happen? What befell a species that had thrived in Europe for more than 300,000 years? This question sparks one of the greatest debates in ancient human studies, and the Toba eruption stands at its center. A number of scholars maintain that modern humans simply outshone the Neanderthals with their better technology and social structure. Our tools were more advanced, our hunting methods more effective, our social webs more extensive. We could sustain larger groups within the same areas of land. Across many centuries, this edge in numbers and innovation gradually forced the Neanderthals from the finest living spaces until no refuge remained. Yet other researchers suggest a more grim scenario. What if the Toba catastrophe had already sealed the Neanderthals' fate? Careful study of Neanderthal genetic material, painstakingly retrieved from old remains, reveals a troubling fact. Their genetic variation was far less than that of modern humans, markedly less. This implies that Neanderthal groups experienced their own severe population crash, perhaps even more drastic than our own. And when did this crash happen? At approximately 70,000 years ago, precisely when Toba erupted. Picture the scene. Mount Toba erupts, casting the entire planet into a volcanic winter. In Africa, the human population dwindles to just 10,000 souls. Yet the Neanderthals of Europe, already fewer in number and lacking genetic variety, suffer an even greater blow. They might fall to merely a few thousand, perhaps a few hundred. They endure, they recover, but they never truly regain their former strength. Their numbers stay small, scattered, and genetically depleted, a species still limping from a catastrophe it could not overcome. Then, 10 millennia later, modern humans appear. They are not conquerors per se, but rivals who possess something the Neanderthals had lost. Demographic resilience, genetic variety, and the capacity to rebound swiftly from adversity, these were the advantages. In this interpretation, it was not modern humans who vanquished the Neanderthals. It was Toba. We merely occupied the ecological niche they could no longer sustain. The same narrative may account for the fate of the Denisovans, that enigmatic third human species who once roamed Asia. They too vanished around the same era, assimilated or supplanted by the spreading modern humans. Their genetic variety was also remarkably limited, pointing to a drastic bottleneck some 70,000 years in the past. Yet the tale grows far more intriguing. Some scientists now doubt that Toba was truly as catastrophic as we have long assumed. This controversy has erupted over the past 10 years, fueled by fresh discoveries. Archaeological digs across India, Southeast Asia, and Africa reveal signs of uninterrupted human habitation that persisted straight through the time of the eruption. Stone implements from before Toba are strikingly alike those from after Toba. The technological record shows no clear interruption. The archaeological evidence bears no indication of a massive population crash. Some researchers propose that the genetic bottleneck detected in human DNA might be explained by other factors. Perhaps it was not one sudden catastrophe but a prolonged decline. Maybe the causes were altogether different disease, for instance, or rivalry among human communities. Climate records from that time are also under review. Certain ice core samples suggest the volcanic winter may have been briefer and milder than previously believed. Regional climate simulations indicate that Africa, home to the majority of humans, might have been partly protected from the harshest impacts. A contentious hypothesis even posits that the genetic bottleneck occurred tens of millennia before Toba. Human numbers were already shrinking when the volcano exploded. So, where does the truth lie? Did Toba nearly wipe out our species? Or is it merely a handy scapegoat for demographic shifts that were already happening? The honest reply is, we cannot be sure. The evidence is fragmentary, frequently conflicting, open to various readings. Researchers continue to debate it in scholarly journals and at conferences. Every year brings fresh data that either reinforces or undermines the Toba catastrophe theory. Yet this much we can state with certainty. Around 70,000 years ago, something befell humanity, shrinking our genetic variety to a level that should have meant extinction. Whether Toba alone or a confluence of causes, our ancestors passed through a bottleneck so intense that it etched lasting signatures into our DNA. And yet, somehow, we survived. That survival is inscribed within every living person today. If you follow your lineage far enough into the past, you will discover that you are descended from that small band of survivors. Every one of us, every human on this planet, bears the genetic heritage of that brush with annihilation. Reflect on the significance of that fact. Everyone you have encountered, every individual recorded in history, all who erected the pyramids, penned Shakespeare's works, or set foot on the moon, they all trace their lineage back to perhaps 1,280 breeding pairs that endured the most severe climatic catastrophe in human existence. Each one of us, without exception, is a descendant of those who survived. This inheritance molded us deeply. The population collapse did not merely shrink our numbers, it honed our species, choosing characteristics that would become essential for our eventual mastery of the Earth. Survivors had to be flexible, as environments shifted without pause. In the era following Toba, collectives able to alter their tactics and utilize fresh nourishment. Those that accommodated changing weather patterns enjoyed greater survival odds. Across countless generations, such pressures favored mental adaptability, the capacity to think inventively and address unprecedented challenges. Cooperation was essential. Tiny groups could not withstand internal strife. Clans that collaborated, divided supplies, and preserved social unity endured. Those that failed to do so vanished. This process refined social intelligence, the talent for interpreting motives, forming bonds, and sustaining intricate social webs. Communication became a necessity. Wisdom for survival required flawless transmission across ages. Hunting methods, craft of tool creation, data on resources and perils all needed dependable conveyance. Hence, immense pressure drove the evolution of complex speech. Innovation was imperative. What succeeded previously could fail later. Communities that invented fresh technologies, novel survival techniques, and innovative methods to harness their surroundings gained benefits. This favored imagination, trial, and the readiness to attempt unexamined answers to unexamined difficulties. Every such trait, tempered in the forge of near annihilation, laid the groundwork for human triumph. As contemporary humans eventually spread worldwide, they bore a repertoire of mental and social skills that no other creature could rival. The exodus from Africa 60 millennia ago marked merely the start. In 15,000 years, People had populated all continents save Antarctica. By 15,000 years past, farming had emerged, and by 10,000 years ago, urban settlements were rising. 5,000 years in the past, writing was created, and the rate of transformation sped up dramatically. Innovations that required hundreds of millennia before the population crash now appeared within a few thousand years. Implements of stone were succeeded by bronze, then iron, then steel, while wandering clans transformed into farming hamlets, later into towns, then cities, then empires. Human numbers followed a like path. Around 10,000 years ago, near agriculture's birth, global population stood at perhaps 5 million souls. Modest by today's measure, yet 500 times greater than the post-Toba bottleneck numbers. By 5,000 years ago, perhaps 50 million people existed. 2,000 years ago, 300 million. By 1800 CE, 1 billion. And presently, more than 8 billion. That is 800,000 times the bottleneck population. From 10,000 to 8 billion in 70,000 years. Yet this explosive growth prompts troubling inquiries. If we once teetered on the brink of extinction, might it recur? Today's dangers differ from those of Toba, yet they could prove equally lethal. Climate alteration, fueled not by volcanic activity but by our own carbon releases, endangers the farming networks that sustain countless millions. Atomic arms, offspring of that very technological inventiveness which rescued us from annihilation, now hold the power to terminate civilization within our lifetime. The recent pandemic shows just how delicate our linked global community truly is. A microbe that would once have endangered just one small group of ancient foragers 70 millennia ago can now travel across the entire Earth in mere weeks. Technologies like artificial intelligence, biological engineering, and nanoscale machines bring us both wonderful possibilities and serious dangers that early humans never faced. Are we stronger today than our ancestors from 70,000 years past, or have we become more delicate? In certain aspects, our toughness is remarkable. We possess devices that would appear as sorcery to those who came before us. Our understanding of science allows us to foresee and ready ourselves for hazards. Worldwide information systems enable us to organize reactions against perils. We truly hold the gathered knowledge from 70,000 years of endurance. Yet, in other respects, we have grown alarmingly vulnerable. Farming methods rely on consistent weather cycles. Our financial structures demand ongoing expansion and the taking of natural materials. Our machines depend on intricate worldwide networks to supply parts and materials. With 8 billion people, we require an incredible quantity of nourishment, hydration, and power each and every day. A calamity that could wipe out 9/10 of a foraging community might destroy 99% of today's society. This is not because we are weaker as people, but because our systems are. Our structures are so intricate and linked that a disastrous breakdown might spread in ways never seen before. The Great Contraction taught early humans a vital truth. To endure, one must be able to change. When the environment shifts, you adapt or perish. The inquiry remains, do present-day humans still possess that adaptability, or have we become trapped in structures too inflexible to withstand yet another real catastrophe? Yet, there is an important point to ponder. The 10,000 individuals who endured Toba possessed no benefits that we are without. They had only simple stone implements and flame, and had no scientific grasp of the events unfolding around them. There were no international plans or disaster teams. Instead, they held on to something more straightforward and yet mightier, a determination never to surrender. Over many generations, confronting circumstances that ought to have ended them, they adjusted, created, worked together, and lived on. They did not act out of a desire to rescue the human race. Indeed, they likely never considered humanity as an idea. They persisted because they wished for their offspring to survive, because they cared deeply for one another, because yielding was not part of who they were. That same fierce endurance lives within us. That is the heritage etched into our chromosomes by 117,000 years of evolution's pressure within and following the narrow passage. We are the offspring of those who endured the unsurvivable, who beheld a world reduced to cinders and gloom, yet they chose to continue forward. They forfeited all, save one another, and resolved that was sufficient. Each difficulty that humankind has conquered, ever after glacial periods, epidemics, conflicts, starvation, we have triumphed because we bear that heritage. We are the offspring of the 10,000, the inheritors of those who came through the constriction. The tale of Toba, regardless of whether it is quite as spectacular as we believed, imparts a deep lesson about our position on Earth's timeline. We are not the certain outcome of aeons of development. We are the unlikely survivors of innumerable narrow escapes, a kind that ought perhaps to have vanished many times, yet continues to endure. Our presence is conditional and delicate. Had that tiny group 70 millennia ago chosen another path, had weather conditions been somewhat harsher, had supplies been a little more limited, you would not exist. Not a single one of us would. Perhaps another species could have risen to rule the planet, or perhaps none at all. Yet they did not perish. They endured. Their survival is the reason we are here. Our existence stems from 10,000 individuals who refused to surrender 70 millennia ago. They adapted when change appeared hopeless. They chose cooperation over easier conflict, and they innovated when old ways crumbled. Their love for their children drove them to struggle for a tomorrow they would never witness. That is who they were. We are the offspring of those who endured, bearing the genes and culture of the most remarkable recovery in human history. That is our origin. From a mere 10,000 to 8 billion, from the brink of annihilation to Earth's ruling species, from isolated groups of desperate survivors, emerged a civilization that landed on the moon and now eyes Mars. This is the most unlikely triumph in all of Earth's living history. It began with humans, much like ourselves. They confronted challenges remarkably similar to our own, opting for survival when doom appeared certain. The real query is whether we can repeat such a feat if necessary. So let us take a moment to truly reflect on its significance. What you have just learned is not some distant, abstract past. This is your own narrative, your very personal beginning. Each one watching this video, every listener drifting into slumber tonight, you are all descendants of those 180 survivors. They would not surrender when the world itself opposed them. Their genetic material is yours. Their fortitude is written into your very DNA. The fused chromosome that defines humanity is the imprint of that population crash. Evidence that your lineage stared down outright annihilation and, against all logic, endured. Consider the path they traveled. 70 millennia ago, your forebears sheltered in caves and seaside havens as volcanic winter transformed the planet into a frozen desert. They observed their companions and relatives perish. They saw the population plummeted from tens of thousands to scarcely over 1,000 souls. For roughly 117,000 years, they existed on a knife's edge. Each generation questioned whether it would be the final one, and every newborn was a minor miracle against immense odds. Yet they did more than merely survive. They flourished. They diverged into 3 separate human species, each refining unique methods of survival. They dispersed over 3 continents, crafting tools, speech, customs, and creativity. They devised the earliest organized hunting methods, the initial funeral rituals, and the first exchange systems. They laid civilization's groundwork even while dwelling in caverns. Then rivalry emerged as the 3 human groups met, forcing a choice between collaboration and conflict. They did both. They intermingled genetically, passing on adaptations that still aid high-altitude living today. They clashed, vying for identical resources in a planet still healing from disaster. In time, one species, yours, cultivated the versatility and resilience to outlive the rest. It wasn't due to physical strength. Neanderthals could effortlessly overpower a modern human. Nor was it intelligence. Neanderthal brains were, in fact, larger. Our victory came from our greater capacity to adapt. As the persistent environmental changes in Africa kept us evolutionarily pliable, the bottleneck favored those who could innovate and cooperate, and the skill to shift strategies as conditions changed. From that small group of 1,800 individuals, humanity expanded. Tens of thousands endured the immediate catastrophe, hundreds of thousands a few millennia later, millions by the time agriculture emerged. Today, 8 billion humans walk the earth. Each one carries the genetic imprint of that narrow passage. Each one descends from ancestors who stared extinction in the eye and chose never to surrender. Yet what truly moves me, what lingers in my mind at night as I reflect on this tale, is that those people didn't know they were saving humanity. They had no grand vision to preserve the species for future generations. They simply tried to survive one more day, to find food for their children, to keep the fire alive through another cold night, to reach the next season. They did what humans have always done. They adapted, they innovated, they cared for each other. And somehow, that was enough. So now, I want you to imagine something. Really place yourself in their shoes. You are living 70,000 years ago. The sun has vanished behind a shroud of volcanic ash. The temperature has fallen by 15 degrees. Animals are perishing. Plants are withering. Your group is starving. What would you have done? Would you have continued when everything seemed hopeless? Would you have figured out how to catch fish when the land animals disappeared? Would you have shared your last bit of food with another person's child? I like to believe I would have. I like to believe that same survivor instinct still lies within all of us. 'Cause here's the truth. We might need it again. Could we survive another global catastrophe today? We possess technology our ancestors could never have imagined. Climate-controlled buildings, global supply chains, satellite communication, and agricultural science that can grow food in deserts. But we also have 8 billion people to feed, instead of 10,000. We have specialized and optimized our systems for efficiency, not flexibility. We depend on infrastructure that is incredibly fragile when you really examine it. A week without power, a month without fuel, a year without reliable growing seasons. How would modern civilization handle it? Would our technology save us, or would our reliance on that technology doom us? I don't have answers to these questions, but I believe they are worth asking, because the story of the bottleneck is not just about the past. It is about resilience. It is about the extraordinary human ability to face impossible challenges and somehow find a way forward. Your ancestors did it with stone tools and fire. They did it with nothing but their intelligence, their cooperation, and their absolute refusal to give up. That same ability lives in you. That same resilience is encoded in your DNA. You are the product of the greatest survival story ever told. So, if you found this story as fascinating as I do, if learning about humanity's brush with extinction has changed how you see yourself and your place in history, do me a favor. Hit that like button, help others discover this incredible story, and leave a comment. I want to know where you are listening from tonight, and what part of the world you are in. What time is it where you are? Are you in Africa, where your ancestors survived the worst of the volcanic winter, or Europe, where Neanderthals once roamed? Asia, home of the mysterious Denisovans, or somewhere else entirely? And tell me honestly, will you look at humanity differently after hearing this? Will you see a stranger on the street and think, we share the same survivor ancestors? If you want more stories like this, deep dives into the forgotten moments that shaped our species, the unseen pivotal moments that shaped our very existence, please consider subscribing to this channel, because there are countless additional tales to tell. Eras, when the outcome was uncertain and yet we found a way to endure. Survivors of that population bottleneck were uncertain whether humankind would endure, yet they persevered regardless. They confronted nature's most brutal assaults and persisted for 117,000 years, teetering on the brink of annihilation. They started anew from a group so tiny that every individual you encounter today is, in effect, a distant relative. If they could withstand that ordeal, if they could endure volcanic winter and the brink of genetic collapse, and still lay the groundwork for 8 billion descendants, then, perhaps, just perhaps, we too can meet whatever trials lie ahead. Rest peacefully this night, comforted by the knowledge that you are descended from survivors, carrying that truth within you, that regardless of what transpired today, Whatever difficulties you are encountering, you bear the genetic legacy of those who never surrendered. Even when surrender would have been the simpler path, you are a descendant of those bottleneck survivors. And that holds meaning. That holds everything.